Dr. Margaret Thompson's bloodied hands trembled inside the Lioness, gunshots echoing across the Kenyan savannah as she whispered, "Come on, baby. Just a little more." At 72, most women her age were planning funeral arrangements. Here she was, delivering cubs while poachers closed in with assault rifles. The radio crackled with Jamie's desperate voice. "Doc, they're 200 yards out and closing fast." David's rifle answered from the ridge, muzzle flashes lighting the acacia trees like deadly fireflies. His agonized shout cut through the chaos. "I can't hold them much longer." Maggie felt the cub's tiny heartbeat against her palm, remembering Robert's last words about protecting their cubs. She'd thought he meant their children, but maybe he meant all of them. Her Parkinson's-stricken hands steadied with purpose as another contraction gripped the Lioness. "Choose now, old woman!" Marcus screamed, his pistol trained on her head. "Step away or die with that animal." What price would a grandmother pay to bring new life into this brutal world? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Dr. Margaret Maggie Thompson sat in her empty Billings, Montana kitchen, staring at 2 coffee cups she'd set out of habit, one for herself, one for Robert, who'd been dead for 8 months. The silence pressed against her eardrums like cotton, broken only by the grandfather clock Robert had bought for their 40th anniversary. Tick-tock, tick-tock, each second stretching toward a future she couldn't imagine. At 72, Maggie had steady hands that had delivered thousands of calves, foals, and puppies across 4 decades of veterinary practice. Now those same hands shook when she tried to button her cardigan, the early stages of Parkinson's stealing away the one thing that had always defined her. "Steady hands, steady heart," Robert used to say, watching her guide breech births and perform delicate surgeries. The irony wasn't lost on her. She could save everyone's animals except the one that mattered most, Robert himself. Her children called dutifully but distantly. Jessica, 45 and razor-sharp as the CEO of a Manhattan consulting firm, managed exactly 15 minutes every Sunday between board meetings and yoga classes. "Mom, you sound tired. Are you taking your vitamins?" Michael, her lawyer son in Seattle, specialized in corporate mergers and 20-minute check-ins between depositions. Neither had visited since the funeral, their lives orbiting success while hers spiraled into irrelevance. The brochure arrived on a Tuesday, sandwiched between Medicare statements and grocery store circulars. Volunteer Veterinary Course, Kenya Wildlife Sanctuary. The photograph showed a lioness nuzzling her cubs beneath an acacia tree, golden light streaming across the Masai Mara savanna. Something stirred in Maggie's chest, a flutter she hadn't felt since Robert's diagnosis. Purpose, adventure, a reason to use her hands for something other than sorting pills. Her children's reactions were predictably horrified. "Mom, you're 72!" Jessica shrieked through the phone, her voice cracking with Manhattan stress. "This is absolutely insane. Dad wouldn't want this." Michael's lawyer voice carried equal parts condescension and concern. "Mother, Kenya is dangerous. You have Parkinson's. What if something happens?" But Maggie remembered Robert's last coherent words, whispered through the oxygen mask as COVID ravaged his lungs. "Take care of our cubs, Maggie." She'd assumed he meant Jessica and Michael, but watching them now, successful, self-sufficient, and utterly absorbed in their own lives, she wondered if he'd meant something else entirely. The decision crystallized like ice forming on a windshield. Maggie liquidated her retirement accounts, sold the ranch equipment, and donated $500,000 to the Kenyan sanctuary. The remaining $347,000 would fund her adventure and whatever came after. If her children thought she was losing her mind, so be it. She'd been losing pieces of herself for months, her husband, her purpose, her steady hands. Maybe it was time to lose herself completely in something that mattered. Africa waited like a question mark on the horizon, and for the first time since Robert's death, Maggie Thompson felt ready to answer. The Jomo Kenyatta International Airport hit Maggie like a physical blow, waves of heat, diesel fumes, and humanity crashing over her as she stepped off the plane. The cacophony of Swahili, English, and a dozen other languages blended with car horns and vendors hawking everything from carved elephants to bottled water. Her hands shook as she gripped her carry-on, and for a terrifying moment she wondered if Jessica had been right. What was a 72-year-old widow with Parkinson's doing in Kenya? Dr. Thompson? A weathered man in khaki approached, his Kansas accent cutting through the chaos like a familiar hymn. James Jamie Harrison looked younger than his 35 years until you saw his eyes, the kind of hollow that comes from watching everything you love slip away. Welcome to Kenya. Hope the flight wasn't too rough. During the 3-hour drive to the Masai Mara Sanctuary, Jamie's story unfolded in careful fragments. 8 years in Kenya, wife Sarah lost to breast cancer 3 years back. No children because there was always another endangered species that needed saving first. Sarah used to joke that I loved animals more than people, he said, hands steady on the wheel as they navigated dirt roads that would challenge a mountain goat. Turns out she was right, just not for the reasons she thought. The sanctuary sprawled across 10,000 acres of golden grassland, acacia trees dotting the landscape like ancient sentinels. Maggie's breath caught as a herd of zebras galloped past their Land Rover, their hoofbeats drumming against the earth like thunder. There, Jamie pointed toward a rocky outcropping. That's where you'll meet your first patients. Nuru emerged from the shade like liquid gold, her tawny coat rippling with muscle and grace. The lioness moved with careful dignity, favoring her right rear leg, an old injury that had never healed properly. Beside her, Simba stood guard, his massive frame and dark mane marking him as the pride's undisputed king. Nuru means light in Swahili, Jamie explained. Simba's pretty obvious. They've been together 4 years, survived drought, poachers, territory wars. She's never had cubs that survived past 3 months. Maggie's veterinary instincts kicked in immediately. Nuru's gait suggested hip dysplasia, possibly from malnutrition during her youth. The lioness watched them with intelligent amber eyes that reminded Maggie uncomfortably of Mrs. Henderson's ancient tabby cat, all-knowing patience and barely concealed judgment. She's in pain, Maggie murmured, her hands steadying as professional purpose overrode personal anxiety. That first week blurred into a symphony of animal calls, dust-choked sunsets, and the peculiar satisfaction of useful exhaustion. Maggie treated everything from elephant seal wounds to baby antelope with broken legs. Her hands, so treacherous at home when holding coffee cups, found their old steadiness when splinting a cheetah's fractured paw or administering antibiotics to a rhino with an infected horn socket. These hands still know their purpose, she told herself each morning, flexing fingers that responded better to Kenya's warm air than Montana's bitter cold. The first sign of trouble came during her 3rd week when the radio communications began stuttering with static interference. Jamie frowned at the crackling receiver, adjusting frequencies that should have connected them clearly to Nairobi headquarters. Probably solar flares, he muttered, but his eyes suggested he suspected something else entirely. The second sign was Marcus Williams stepping off a chartered helicopter like he owned the place, his investment banker swagger intact despite the khaki safari outfit that screamed wealthy tourist. Maggie's son-in-law had always made her skin crawl, too smooth, too quick with compliments that felt like appraisals. "Surprise, Mom," he called, arms spread wide. "Jessica thought you might be lonely out here, so I came to check on our favorite adventurer." Behind Marcus came 3 men with expensive cameras and the kind of muscle that suggested they'd never seen the inside of a documentary studio. "Meet the crew," Marcus said, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. "We're making a film about your incredible journey." America needs to see what their grandmothers are capable of, right? Jamie's jaw tightened as he watched the film crew unload military-grade communication equipment along with their cameras. When Maggie questioned the arsenal of electronics, Marcus laughed it off. "Modern documentaries require serious tech, Mom. We want to capture every authentic moment." The third sign was David Kruger emerging from the tree line like a ghost, materialized from Maggie's worst nightmares. The man moved with predatory grace, his Texas drawl carrying the kind of threat that made experienced soldiers step backward. Scars crisscrossed his weathered face, and a child's toy lion dangled from his belt like a grotesque talisman. "Y'all got a problem," he said simply, his pale eyes fixed on Marcus's helicopter, "and that problem's about to get a whole lot worse." Jamie's hand dropped to his sidearm, but David raised both palms peacefully. "Easy there, Ranger. I'm not your enemy. But them boys with the fancy cameras, they sure as hell ain't making no documentary." David Kruger's revelation hit the sanctuary like lightning splitting an ancient baobab tree. The man who'd emerged from the savannah like death personified slowly holstered his rifle and pulled out a battered photograph, a gap-toothed boy with freckles and a cowlick clutching the same toy lion that now hung from David's belt like a prayer. "Tommy was 8 years old when I took him on his first hunting safari." David's voice cracked like drought-hardened earth. 10 years ago, right here in the Mara, I'd wounded a lioness, clean shot through the shoulder, should have dropped her clean. But she kept running, and I got cocky, thought we could track her easy." His hands trembled as he touched the toy lion. "Found her in a ravine, bleeding out. 3 cubs hidden behind her. Tommy wanted to help the babies, said they looked scared. Jamie kept his weapon ready, but his posture shifted from aggressive to listening." Maggie felt her heart clench as David continued, his Texas drawl thick with decade-old grief. "The Lioness had enough fight left for one last charge, went straight for Tommy while I was reloading. By the time I put her down permanent, my boy was—" David's voice shattered completely. "I created the monster that killed my son. Been hunting the monsters ever since. Poachers, trophy hunters, anyone who turns these beautiful creatures into trophies or cash." The implications hit Maggie like a physical blow. "You're not here to hurt us. You're here to protect the lions." "Been tracking your son-in-law's operation for 3 months," David confirmed, his pale eyes shifting toward the sanctuary buildings where Marcus's crew was setting up equipment. "That ain't no documentary crew, Doc. Those boys are professional poachers, and Marcus Williams owes some very dangerous people a very large amount of money." Jamie's radio crackled with interference, and David shook his head grimly. "They're jamming communications, standard operating procedure before a major extraction. Lions like Nuru and Simba are worth $50,000 each on the black market. Cubs go for 20. But it was David's next revelation that made Maggie's blood run cold. "There's more. Williams took out a $2 million life insurance policy on you 6 months ago, Doc. Listed himself as beneficiary through Jessica's power of attorney. Far as I can tell, you having an accident with dangerous wildlife would solve all his financial problems at once." The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. Marcus's sudden interest in her African adventure, the convenient timing of his arrival, the expensive equipment that had nothing to do with filmmaking. Jessica's signature on documents she probably never read, trusting her husband to handle boring financial stuff while she focused on running her company. "That bastard," Maggie whispered, then louder. "That absolute bastard. He's been planning this from the beginning." Jamie's military training kicked in as he assessed their tactical situation. "How many men?" 8 total. Marcus plus 7 professionals. Ex-military, probably Serbian or Ukrainian muscle. They'll move fast once they're ready. Tranquilize the lions, eliminate witnesses, stage it like you interrupted a poaching operation and got caught in the crossfire. David's scarred face hardened into granite. But here's what they don't know. I've been sabotaging their equipment for weeks, cutting brake lines, contaminating their tranquilizer doses, feeding false intel about lion locations. Tommy didn't die so these sons of bitches could turn his mother's killers into commodities. The irony wasn't lost on Maggie. The man whose hunting had ultimately led to his son's death was now their only hope of survival. "What do you need us to do?" "First, we get you somewhere safe," David said. "Then No." Maggie's voice carried the authority of 4 decades treating panicked animals and their frantic owners. "I'm not running. These lions trust me and I won't abandon them." "Doc, with respect, you're 72 years old with Parkinson's disease. This ain't what? A fight for an old woman?" Maggie's eyes blazed with fury that surprised even her. That old woman delivered 1,000 breech births, performed surgery on horses while they were standing, and pulled calves from mothers who'd been laboring for 18 hours. My hands might shake when I'm nervous, but they're steady as bedrock when something needs doing. Jamie watched this exchange with growing respect. He'd seen plenty of tough folks wilt under pressure, but something in Maggie Thompson was crystallizing into pure steel. "What about Nuru? She's been acting strange the past few days." David's expression shifted to something approaching wonder. "That's because she's pregnant. Been watching her for months. Behavior patterns, nesting instincts, the way Simba's protecting her. She's maybe 6 weeks out from giving birth." The revelation hit Maggie like divine intervention. After losing 3 pregnancies of her own, after watching Robert slip away despite her medical knowledge, here was a chance to help bring new life into the world. Cubs that could survive, thrive, carry on their bloodline in a world increasingly hostile to their kind. "Then we have 6 weeks to figure this out," she said firmly. "No, Doc," David's voice carried grim certainty. "Based on what I've observed of Marcus's timeline, we've got maybe 48 hours. They're planning to move during the new moon. No ambient light, perfect cover for extraction." Jamie checked his watch and swore creatively. "New moon's tomorrow night." The weight of impossible choices settled over them like dust from the approaching dry season. Run and abandon the lions to certain death. Stay and face professional killers with military-grade weapons. Try to evacuate Nuru and Simba, risking the pregnancy and their own lives. "There's one more thing," David said quietly. "I recognize those scars on Nuru's flanks. I put them there 10 years ago when I wounded her before she killed Tommy. She's the lioness that took my boy." The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with the weight of grief, guilt, and the terrible mathematics of revenge versus redemption. The revelation that Nuru was the lioness who killed David's son hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, acrid and inescapable. Maggie watched the man's face cycle through emotions she recognized from her own grief, rage, disbelief, and something that might have been relief. For 10 years, he'd been hunting an abstract enemy. Now that enemy had a name, a face, and was carrying cubs that represented everything he'd spent a decade trying to protect. "Jesus Christ," Jamie whispered, his Kansas pragmatism struggling with the cosmic irony. "What are the odds?" "In the Mara." "Higher than you'd think," David said, his voice hollow as a dried gourd. "Lions don't migrate like wildebeest. Family groups stay in the same territory for generations. I should have known." He touched Tommy's toy lion with fingers that shook worse than Maggie's Parkinson's. "Question is, what do I do with that knowledge?" Maggie studied David's weathered face, seeing past the scars to the grieving father beneath. "What would Tommy want you to do?" The question hit David like a physical blow. He staggered backward, one hand pressed against his chest as if she'd driven a knife between his ribs. That's not... You can't ask me that. I just did. Maggie's voice carried the gentle authority she'd used with panicked pet owners and dying animals. That little boy who wanted to help scared cubs. What would he tell his daddy to do? Before David could answer, Marcus's voice cut across the sanctuary like a chainsaw through silence. Mom, there you are. We've been looking everywhere. He approached with 3 of his fake documentary crew, their cameras conspicuously absent but their tactical vests very much present. Who's your new friend? Jamie stepped protectively in front of Maggie, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. David Kruger, anti-poaching consultant. We called him in when we noticed unusual activity in the area. Marcus's smile never wavered, but his eyes went reptilian cold. How wonderful. Always good to have extra security. His gaze fixed on David with predatory assessment. Kruger. Why does that name sound familiar? Probably read about me in the papers, David drawled, his Texas accent thick as molasses. I specialize in hunting men who hunt endangered species. Quite a few of them won't be troubling nobody no more. The threat hung between them like a loaded gun. Marcus's crew shifted position, hands drifting toward concealed weapons, but their boss maintained his civilized facade. Well, I'm sure that won't be necessary here. We're just making a documentary about Mom's incredible adventure. Speaking of which, Maggie interjected, her voice sweet as poisoned honey, Jessica mentioned you've been handling some financial arrangements for me. How thoughtful. Marcus's smile flickered like a candle in wind. Just making sure you're taken care of, Mom. Family looks out for family. Absolutely, Maggie agreed. That's why I've been thinking about updating my will. You know, after seeing all this incredible wildlife, I'm considering leaving everything to conservation efforts. Every last penny. The color drained from Marcus's face before he caught himself. That's very generous. But maybe you should discuss major financial decisions with Jessica first. Oh, I plan to call her tonight, Maggie lied smoothly. Can't wait to tell her about the new life insurance policy I'm taking out. $2.5 million, with the sanctuary as beneficiary. Figured if something happens to me out here, at least the lions would benefit. Jamie shot her a questioning look, but played along. The paperwork's already drawn up. Just needs her signature. Marcus's facade cracked completely. Mom, you can't be serious. Jessica and the kids need financial security. You can't just give away their inheritance to animals. Watch me, Maggie said, her voice carrying 40 years of veterinary authority. Robert always said I was too soft-hearted for my own good. Maybe it's time to prove him right. That evening, as the African sun painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, the 3 unlikely allies gathered in Jamie's quarters to plan their defense. David had spent the afternoon conducting reconnaissance, his military training evident in the detailed intelligence he provided. They've got motion sensors positioned around the lion enclosure, he reported, sketching positions on a hand-drawn map. Thermal imaging equipment, encrypted communications, and enough firepower to level a small village. This ain't no smash-and-grab operation. They're planning a full military-style extraction. Jamie studied the positions with growing concern. We can't call for backup. Even if the radio interference clears, nearest Kenya Wildlife Service station is 4 hours away. By then, we'll all be feeding the vultures, David said grimly. They're planning to move during tomorrow night's new moon. Perfect darkness. No witnesses. Maggie examined David's intelligence report, her veterinary mind automatically assessing threats and resources. What about Nuru and Simba? Can we move them? Pregnant lioness 6 weeks from delivery. Moving her now could kill both her and the cubs. David's voice carried the weight of hard experience. Besides, Simba won't leave his territory without a fight that'll bring every ranger in a 50-mile radius running. As if summoned by their conversation, the evening air filled with Simba's territorial roar, a sound that vibrated through Maggie's chest like thunder. In the distance, other males answered, their voices weaving together in an ancient song of dominance and defiance. "He knows something's wrong," Jamie observed. "Lions can sense tension better than humans," David nodded grimly. "In the morning, they'll start probing our defenses, testing response times, identifying weak points. We've got maybe 18 hours to prepare." The weight of impossible odds settled over them like a burial shroud. 3 people, a grieving widower with a rifle, a broken father seeking redemption, and a 72-year-old veterinarian with shaking hands against 8 professional killers with military equipment. "There's something else," David said quietly. "I intercepted part of a radio transmission earlier. Marcus isn't just after the lions. He's got buyers lined up for everything: ivory, rhino horn, rare bird eggs. This sanctuary's been marked as a target-rich environment." Maggie felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. Not just Nuru and Simba, but every animal she'd treated over the past month. The baby elephant with the infected trunk wound, the cheetah family recovering from snare injuries, the elderly rhinoceros who'd learned to trust her gentle touch. "Over my dead body," she said quietly. "Doc, that might be exactly what they're counting on," Jamie warned. "Then they're going to be disappointed." Maggie stood, her back straight despite 72 years of gravity. "I didn't survive Robert's death, my children's indifference and Parkinson's disease just to let some banker's greed destroy this place." David watched her with something approaching awe. "You know this is suicide, right? These men are professionals. They've done this before." "So have I," Maggie replied. "Just not with humans." As the 3 of them planned their desperate defense, none of them noticed the small recording device Marcus had planted in Jamie's quarters. Miles away, in a luxury tent equipped with satellite communications, Marcus Williams smiled as he listened to their conversation. By morning, he would know exactly how to destroy the only 3 people standing between him and $8 million worth of endangered wildlife. But Marcus had made one critical error in his surveillance. He'd focused so intently on the humans that he'd completely ignored the animals. And in the darkness beyond the camp, Nuru was exhibiting behavior that would have alarmed any experienced wildlife veterinarian. The lioness wasn't just pregnant. She was going into premature labor, triggered by the stress of sensing imminent danger to her pride. The cubs that weren't supposed to arrive for 6 weeks were coming tomorrow night, just as Marcus's killers prepared to strike. Dawn broke over the Masai Mara like a bloodstain spreading across canvas, the African sun painting the acacia trees in shades of amber and gold that should have been beautiful, but felt ominous. Maggie woke to the sound of Nuru's distressed vocalizations, low guttural moans that every veterinarian recognized as the prelude to labor complications. "Jesus, no," she whispered, grabbing her medical bag and rushing toward the lion enclosure. Jamie and David were already there, their faces grim as they watched Nuru pace restlessly around the rocky outcropping that served as her den. The lioness's breathing was labored, her flanks heaving with contractions that came too fast, too early. "She's in active labor," Maggie confirmed after a quick visual assessment. 6 weeks premature. The stress from yesterday must have triggered it. Her hands trembled as she calculated the implications. Premature lion cubs had survival rates approaching 0 in the wild, and moving Nuru now would almost certainly kill both mother and babies. Simba paced nearby, his massive frame radiating anxiety as he watched his mate struggle. The lion's golden eyes tracked every movement of the humans, his tail lashing with the kind of agitation that preceded either flight or violence. David studied the male lion with professional respect and personal dread. This was the beast that had killed Tommy, now protecting his own family with the same fierce devotion that had made David a father. "How long?" Jamie asked, his ranger training focused on practical timeline management. "Could be hours, could be minutes," Maggie replied, her veterinary instincts overriding everything else. First births are unpredictable, and premature labor compounds every risk factor. She watched Nuru's contractions intensify, each one racking the lioness's powerful frame. "She's going to need help." "Doc, with all due respect," David said quietly, "that lioness won't let you within 20 feet during labor. It's against every survival instinct she's got." But Maggie was already moving, her medical bag in one hand, and her voice dropping to the soft, soothing tone she'd used with thousands of frightened animals over 4 decades. "Easy, girl. Easy, Nuru. I know it hurts, sweetheart. I know." To everyone's amazement, including her own, Nuru's amber eyes fixed on Maggie with something approaching recognition. The lioness had allowed the elderly veterinarian to treat her injured hip, to clean infected scratches, to provide the kind of gentle care that wild animals rarely experienced from humans. Now, in her moment of greatest vulnerability, some primal instinct told her that this particular human meant safety. "I'll be damned," David breathed as Nuru actually moved closer to the fence, her massive head nearly touching Maggie's outstretched hand. That's when Marcus's voice cut across the morning air like a machete through silk. "Well, isn't this touching? The old woman and her pet lion." Marcus approached with his full crew now, 8 men in tactical gear carrying automatic weapons with the casual confidence of professionals who'd done this work before. Their leader, a scarred man with Serbian accent and dead eyes, surveyed the sanctuary like a predator assessing prey. "Mom, I'm afraid there's been a change of plans," Marcus continued, his investment banker smile never wavering despite the military hardware surrounding him. "Turns out the documentary angle was getting complicated. Legal issues, insurance concerns, you understand." Jamie's hand dropped to his sidearm, but the Serbian leader, who introduced himself simply as Nikola, shook his head with amused condescension. "I would not recommend that, Ranger man. My associates have very quick reflexes, and your grandmother is standing quite close to very large predator." Maggie felt her world crystallize into sharp focus. Nuru moaned behind her, another contraction rippling through the lioness's frame, and she could hear Simba's warning growl building like distant thunder. David stood 20 feet away, his rifle within reach, but useless against 8 automatic weapons. Jamie's radio crackled with static, communications still jammed. "What do you want?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Simple business transaction," Nikola replied. "Lions are worth good money to right buyers. Sanctuary has many valuable animals. You cooperate, maybe you live to see grandchildren again. And if I don't cooperate?" Marcus answered that one, his facade finally dropping to reveal the cold calculation underneath. "Then you have a very unfortunate accident with dangerous wildlife, and I collect $2 million in life insurance while doing the world a favor by removing illegal poaching operation." The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. Marcus would frame David and Jamie as poachers, stage Maggie's death as a heroic attempt to stop them, and walk away with both the insurance money and the profits from selling endangered animals. Clean, profitable, and completely believable to investigators who would arrive too late to question the evidence. Behind her, Nuru's breathing became more labored, and Maggie realized with veterinary certainty that the lioness was experiencing complications. "The cub is breached," she said quietly. "She's going to die without surgical intervention." "Then she dies," Marcus shrugged. "Dead lions are easier to transport anyway." Something snapped inside Maggie Thompson. 72 years of accumulated grief, frustration, and fury crystallizing into pure maternal rage. "No," she said simply. "No." Nicholas seemed genuinely amused. "Old woman, you do not understand situation. We have guns. You have nothing." "I have steady hands," Maggie replied, turning back to Nuru despite the weapons trained on her spine. "And this lioness trusts me." What happened next violated every principle of animal behavior that David had learned in 20 years of wildlife experience. Nuru, in active labor and surrounded by armed humans, allowed Maggie to approach. Not just approach. The lioness actually moved closer to the fence, her massive head pressing against the chain link as another contraction racked her frame. "Incredible," Jamie whispered, and even Nicola's professional detachment cracked slightly as he watched a 72-year-old woman with Parkinson's disease literally embrace a laboring lioness. Maggie's hands steadied the moment she touched Nuru's flank, her veterinary training overriding every other consideration. She could feel the cub's position through the lioness's taut skin, definitely breached, possibly with umbilical complications that would kill both mother and baby within minutes. "I need to perform an emergency cesarean," she announced, opening her medical bag with movements that had become automatic over 4 decades of practice. "You are insane," Nicholas stated flatly. "We shoot you now, take lions, finish business." "Go ahead," Maggie replied, her hands already prepping sterile instruments. "Shoot a 72-year-old grandmother performing emergency surgery on an endangered species. See how that plays on CNN." David realized what she was doing. Buying time, creating a scenario too bizarre for the poachers to process quickly. These men were prepared for resistance, for escape attempts, for standard defensive tactics. They weren't prepared for an elderly veterinarian performing battlefield surgery on a lioness while automatic weapons were trained on her back. "The cubs are coming now," Maggie announced as another contraction nearly knocked Nuru off her feet. "First one's crowning, but it's backwards. If I don't get it turned, they all die." Simba's roar split the morning air like a battle cry, the massive male lion sensing his mate's distress and responding with all the fury of a king defending his dynasty. The sound made even Nicola's hardened mercenaries flinch, their weapons swinging nervously between human targets and the enormous predator who was beginning to pace with increasing agitation. "How long?" Marcus demanded, his careful plans disintegrating as rapidly as his composure. "Could be minutes, could be hours," Maggie replied, echoing her earlier assessment, but now with weaponized uncertainty. Every second she could delay was another chance for rescue, another opportunity for David or Jamie to find an opening, another moment for the impossible to become merely improbable. Nuru's next contraction was accompanied by a small gush of fluid, and Maggie's experienced hands felt the cub's hindquarters beginning to emerge. "Here we go, sweetheart," she whispered to the lioness. "Just like all the others. Trust your body. Trust me." What she didn't tell anyone was that her Parkinson's medication had worn off 3 hours ago, and her hands were now shaking so badly she could barely hold her instruments. What she also didn't mention was that she'd never performed a cesarean section on a fully conscious lioness without anesthesia, and the statistical probability of success was approaching 0. But Tommy's toy lion caught her eye, dangling from David's belt, and she thought about 8-year-old boys who wanted to help scared cubs. She thought about Robert's last words about protecting their young. She thought about Jessica and Michael, too busy with their successful lives to visit their dying father or their grieving mother. And she thought about Nuru, who had somehow learned to trust the one human who'd shown her gentleness in a world full of violence. "Come on, baby," Maggie whispered as the first cub's hindquarters emerged fully. "Come meet your mama." The first cub emerged in a rush of fluid and membrane, its tiny body limp and unresponsive in Maggie's trembling hands. For a terrifying moment that stretched like eternity, the miniature lion lay motionless, no breath, no movement, no sign of the fierce life that should have animated its perfect form. Maggie's veterinary training kicked in automatically, her fingers clearing the airways while she massaged the tiny chest with movements she'd performed thousands of times on puppies, kittens, and foals. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered desperately, her voice barely audible over Simba's increasingly agitated roars. "Come on, breathe for Mama." The cub's first breath was a tiny gasp that barely disturbed the morning air, but to Maggie it sounded like Gabriel's trumpet announcing resurrection. Nuru immediately began licking her baby with the fierce devotion that had driven lionesses to protect their young for millennia, her rough tongue stimulating circulation and bonding that would last a lifetime. "One down," Maggie announced, but her relief was short-lived as she felt the positioning of the second cub. This one was completely breached, its hindquarters twisted in a way that could tear Nuru's birth canal if not corrected immediately. "This one's stuck. I need to turn it manually." "How long?" Marcus demanded, his investment banker composure cracking as his carefully orchestrated timeline disintegrated. The Serbian mercenaries were growing restless, their professional instincts screaming that extended exposure increased their risk exponentially. "These things take time," Maggie replied, though she knew time was the one commodity they lacked. Her hands, guided by 4 decades of obstetrical experience, worked inside Nuru's birth canal to reposition the trapped cub. The lioness groaned with each adjustment, but somehow maintained her trust in the elderly human who was causing pain to prevent greater tragedy. The second cub came faster than expected, sliding into Maggie's hands like a slippery miracle. This one was smaller than its sibling, but its lungs were already functioning. Tiny, mewling cries that spoke of strength and determination to survive. Nuru's maternal instincts took over immediately, her attention split between 2 cubs who needed her warmth and protection. "2," Maggie breathed, but she could feel there was at least one more. Lion litters typically ranged from 1 to 4 cubs, and Nuru's extended labor suggested multiple births. Sure enough, the third cub began crowning almost immediately, this one positioned correctly, but struggling against an umbilical cord that had wrapped around its neck like a noose. "Jesus," Jamie whispered, watching Maggie work with instruments that trembled in her Parkinson's-affected hands but never wavered from their purpose. "She's actually doing it." David's eyes remained fixed on Simba, whose agitation was reaching dangerous levels. The massive male lion understood that his mate was vulnerable, that strange humans surrounded his family, and that the normal order of his world had been disrupted beyond comprehension. "That male's about to charge," he warned quietly. "When he does, those cubs are going to scatter, and Nuru might follow her protective instincts instead of her maternal ones." The third cub's delivery required delicate surgery that would have challenged a fully equipped veterinary hospital, let alone an elderly woman working in the African dust with hands that shook from neurological disease. Maggie had to cut the umbilical cord that threatened to strangle the baby, guide it through a birth canal traumatized by the previous difficult deliveries, and do it all while Nuru groaned and shifted with pain that would have incapacitated most mammals. But when the third cub emerged, perfect, breathing, and immediately seeking its mother's warmth, Maggie allowed herself a moment of pure triumph. 3 healthy lion cubs, delivered under impossible circumstances, already nursing as their mother cleaned them with devoted attention. "There," she announced, sitting back on her heels with blood-stained hands and sweat streaming down her face despite the morning chill. 3 beautiful babies. Nuru did most of the work. I just helped a little." That's when everything went catastrophically wrong. Nuru, exhausted from the difficult birth and weakened by blood loss that Maggie couldn't control without proper surgical equipment, began hemorrhaging. What started as normal post-birth bleeding quickly escalated into the kind of massive internal hemorrhage that killed mothers throughout the natural world, the cruel mathematics of reproduction where survival was never guaranteed, even after successful delivery. "No," Maggie whispered, watching crimson spread across the ground beneath Nuru's hindquarters. No, no, no. Not after we got this far. The lioness's breathing became labored, her golden eyes growing glassy with the particular exhaustion that preceded shock. Simba sensed immediately that something was wrong, his roars shifting from territorial warning to desperate distress calls that echoed across the savannah like a funeral dirge. She's bleeding out, Jamie realized, his ranger training sufficient to recognize the signs of massive hemorrhage. Can you stop it? Maggie's hands moved frantically through her medical bag, searching for instruments and medications that simply weren't there. She had basic veterinary supplies, antibiotics, and pain management drugs, but nothing approaching the surgical equipment needed to repair internal hemorrhaging in a 300-pound lioness. I need a real operating room, surgical clamps, blood replacement therapy. I can't do this with field equipment. The cubs, sensing their mother's distress, mewled frantically as they searched for warmth and milk from a lioness who was slowly dying beneath them. Nuru's maternal instincts kept her conscious and responsive to their needs, but Maggie could see the life fading from her amber eyes with each labored breath. Marcus watched this development with visible relief. Well, that solves one problem. Dead lions are actually easier to transport than live ones. Shut up, David snarled, his rifle suddenly in his hands, though 8 automatic weapons remained trained on the small group. Just shut your goddamn mouth. But Marcus's cruel pragmatism reflected the harsh reality of their situation. Nuru was dying. Her cubs would follow within hours without their mother's milk and warmth, and the poachers would soon tire of this extended drama and move to eliminate witnesses. Maggie knelt beside the hemorrhaging lioness, her hands pressing desperately against wounds she couldn't see or repair. Blood soaked through her clothing, warm and thick, and carrying the metallic scent of impending death. Nuru's breathing grew shallower with each minute, though her eyes remained focused on her cubs with the devotion that defined motherhood across all species. I'm sorry, Maggie whispered to the dying lioness. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I saved your babies, but I can't save you. The irony was devastating. After losing 3 pregnancies herself, after watching Robert die despite her medical knowledge, after feeling useless and forgotten for months, Maggie had finally helped bring new life into the world. But like so many victories in the natural world, it was incomplete, temporary, shadowed by the same cruel mathematics that governed all existence. Simba's roars had evolved into something beyond mere sound. They were the vocalization of grief, the kind of mourning cry that other lions would hear for miles and understand immediately. His mate was dying, his cubs were orphaned, and the natural order that had sustained his species for millennia was collapsing around him. David watched this tableau with emotions that threatened to overwhelm his professional composure. 10 years ago, he'd wounded the lioness who killed his son. Now he was watching her die while trying to protect the cubs she'd just delivered. The cosmic justice was perfect and horrible. Revenge achieved through the natural consequences of violence, but revenge that felt hollow and meaningless in the face of new life hanging in the balance. How long? Nicola asked, his professional patience finally exhausted. Minutes, Maggie replied honestly, her hands still pressing against wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. She's going into shock. The cubs will follow within hours. Marcus checked his expensive watch with the impatience of a man whose careful plans had been disrupted by the inconvenient messiness of actual life. Then we finish this business and move on. Some losses are acceptable in any operation. But as he spoke, something extraordinary happened. Nuru, despite her blood loss and approaching death, lifted her massive head and looked directly at Maggie with eyes that held unmistakable communication. Not gratitude. Lions didn't experience human emotions, but recognition, acknowledgement. A moment of connection between two mothers who had both experienced the joy and terror of bringing life into a dangerous world. Then Nuru's head fell back to the ground, her breathing stopped, and the Masai Mara became a place where three orphaned cubs cried for a mother who would never answer. The silence that followed Nuru's death was profound and terrible, broken only by the desperate mewling of three orphaned cubs searching for their mother's warmth. Maggie knelt in the spreading pool of blood, her hands still pressed against wounds that no longer mattered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she confronted another failure to save a life that had trusted her completely. "It's over," Marcus announced with the cold satisfaction of a man whose problems had just solved themselves. "Nicola, collect the cubs. They'll bring good money even without the mother." But David Kruger had reached a breaking point that 10 years of guilt and grief had been building toward. The toy lion on his belt seemed to burn against his hip as he watched the same scene that had haunted his nightmares. Orphaned cubs crying for a dead mother, their futures uncertain and likely brief. Only this time, he wasn't the cause of the tragedy. This time, he could choose a different ending. "No," David said quietly, his rifle shifting toward Marcus's crew. "Nobody touches those cubs." Nicola's laugh was genuinely amused. "Old man, you have one rifle. We have 8 automatic weapons. Mathematics is not in your favor." "Maybe not," David agreed, "but I've got nothing left to lose, and y'all are standing between me and the only chance I've had in 10 years to do something Tommy would be proud of." The standoff crystallized into the kind of Western movie moment that would have been absurd if it weren't so deadly serious. David against 8 professionals, Jamie reaching slowly for his sidearm, Maggie cradling 3 cubs who were rapidly losing body heat without their mother's protection. That's when the first helicopter appeared on the horizon, not Marcus's extraction team, but a Kenya Wildlife Service rescue bird that shouldn't have been able to locate them through the communication jamming. Nicola's head snapped toward the approaching aircraft, his professional composure cracking as he realized their operation had been compromised. "How?" Marcus demanded, his investment banker mind racing through the implications of unexpected variables in his carefully calculated plan. "Emergency beacon," Jamie explained, pulling a small device from his pocket. "Been broadcasting our GPS coordinates for the past 6 hours. Takes a while to cut through the interference, but Kenya Wildlife Service has military-grade tracking equipment when they need it." The helicopter's arrival changed the tactical situation completely, but not necessarily in favor of the good guys. Nicola's crew were professionals who'd operated in war zones and understood that extraction under fire required different strategies than quiet elimination of witnesses. Their immediate response was to create hostages and defensive positions. "Everyone down!" Nicola shouted, his accent thickening under stress. "Old woman, you bring cubs and come here now, or we shoot Ranger first, then you, then cubs anyway." Maggie looked down at the 3 cubs nestled against her chest, their tiny bodies trembling with cold and hunger. They were maybe 2 hours old, completely helpless and utterly dependent on whatever protection she could provide. In that moment, holding these orphaned babies while their mother's blood soaked into African soil, she understood something fundamental about her own life. For 72 years, she'd been the helper, the fixer, the one who solved other people's problems while her own needs went unmet. She'd delivered thousands of animals, saved countless lives, supported her children's dreams while her own withered from neglect. Robert had been her anchor, but even he'd never truly understood the depth of her need to nurture, to protect, to be needed. These cubs needed her in a way no one had since her children were small. Not for money or convenience or social obligation, but for survival itself. They were hers now, in the most primal sense possible. "Come on, Mom," Marcus called, his voice carrying the patronizing tone she'd endured for years. Let's finish this business so everyone can go home." "I am home," Maggie replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. She stood slowly, the cubs cradled protectively against her chest, blood and birth fluid staining her clothes like badges of honor. "This is exactly where I belong." The approaching helicopter was close enough now to identify as Kenya Wildlife Service, but also close enough for Marcus's crew to demonstrate their capabilities. Nikola barked orders in Serbian, and two of his men produced shoulder-mounted missiles that would turn the rescue attempt into a fireball of twisted metal and good intentions. "You see?" Nikola called toward the helicopter. "We have hostages and anti-aircraft capability." "You land slowly, no sudden movements, or everyone dies quickly." But the helicopter pilot had military experience and recognized the setup immediately. Instead of landing, the aircraft began circling at maximum range, its powerful spotlight illuminating the sanctuary grounds while maintaining distance from the missile threat. That's when David made his choice. For 10 years, he'd been hunting men who killed endangered species, telling himself it was justice for Tommy's death. But standing in the African dawn, watching 3 orphaned cubs whose mother had died protecting them, he realized he'd been hunting the wrong targets. The real enemy wasn't the lioness who'd killed his son. It was the greed and violence that turned magnificent creatures into commodities. "Nikola," David called, his rifle trained on the Serbian leader. "I've got a proposition for you." "I am listening," Nikola replied warily. "Tommy was 8 when he died." "Same age these cubs would be in human years." David's voice carried the weight of decade-old grief and fresh understanding. "His mama fought to protect him just like their mama died protecting them. What do you say we let the children live and settle this between adults?" The psychological warfare was masterful. David had identified the one element that even hardened mercenaries couldn't completely ignore, the universal recognition of parental protection. Every man in Nikola's crew had been someone's child, and most understood the primal drive to defend offspring. But Marcus's desperation overrode any appeal to humanity. "Enough!" he screamed, pulling his own pistol and pointing it directly at Maggie. "I've got gambling debts that will kill me if I don't deliver, and $2 million in insurance money that solves every problem. The old woman dies now, the lions die next, and everyone else can choose their sides." What happened in the next 30 seconds would be analyzed and debated for months afterward. Marcus fired first, his shot aimed at Maggie's center mass. But David had anticipated the betrayal and was already moving, his body intercepting the bullet meant for the woman holding 3 orphaned cubs. The impact spun David around, Tommy's toy lion flying from his belt to land in the dust near Nuru's body. But even as he fell, David's rifle barked once, a perfect shot that took Marcus between the eyes and eliminated the driving force behind the entire operation. Nikola's crew, professionals who understood when a mission had deteriorated beyond recovery, made the pragmatic choice to cut their losses. The Serbian leader called for immediate extraction, his remaining missiles providing cover as they retreated toward their own helicopter that materialized from behind a ridge. "This contract is terminated," Nikola announced as his team withdrew with military precision. "Dead employer cannot pay bills." Jamie rushed to David's side, applying pressure to the gunshot wound while calling for medical evacuation. The bleeding was serious but not immediately fatal. The bullet had missed major organs and arteries by inches. "The cubs," David gasped, his eyes finding Maggie, who still stood protectively over the orphaned babies. "Tommy would want them safe." "They're safe," Maggie promised, kneeling beside the wounded man who'd sacrificed himself for creatures his son would have loved. "I swear to you, David, they're safe." As the Kenya Wildlife Service helicopter finally landed and disgorged a team of rangers and medical personnel, Maggie realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of family, purpose, and belonging. These cubs weren't replacing her children or her late husband. They were adding a new dimension to her capacity for love. The radio crackled with an incoming transmission that would change everything again. "Mom?" Jessica's voice, strained with tears and airplane static. "Mom, we're on our way. Michael and I are flying to Kenya tonight. We saw the news about Marcus, about what you've been doing. We want to hear everything. We want to help." Maggie looked down at 3 cubs who depended entirely on her protection, then at David being loaded onto a stretcher but still breathing, then at Jamie, whose Kansas decency had never wavered despite impossible circumstances. Her family was expanding in ways she'd never imagined possible. "There's room for everyone," she told her daughter. "Plenty of cubs to go around." For the first time in years, Maggie Thompson's hands weren't shaking at all. 6 months later, the first snowfall of winter dusted the rolling hills of Maggie's Montana ranch, transforming the landscape into something that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those blazing African days. The Thompson Wildlife Sanctuary sprawled across 400 acres of Big Sky country, its custom-built enclosures and rehabilitation facilities funded by a combination of Marcus's recovered embezzlement money, documentary rights, and donations from around the world who'd followed the story of a 72-year-old grandmother who'd delivered lion cubs while under fire. Maggie stood at her kitchen window, watching 3 6-month-old lions play in the snow with the boundless energy that made them simultaneously adorable and dangerous. Hope, Faith, and Robert, named for the virtues Maggie had rediscovered and the husband whose final words had started this entire journey, had adapted to Montana's climate better than anyone expected. Their thick winter coats gleamed in the morning sunlight as they stalked snowflakes with the serious concentration of apex predators practicing their craft. "Coffee's ready," David called from the kitchen table, his left arm still stiff from the gunshot wound but functional enough for the daily tasks of running a wildlife sanctuary. The toy lion that had once hung from his belt now sat on the mantelpiece, surrounded by photographs of Tommy and the cubs whose lives had been saved in their mother's honor. Physical therapy had been challenging, but purpose had proved more healing than any medical intervention. The kitchen filled with the comfortable chaos of extended family as Jessica and her 2 teenagers stumbled downstairs, still adjusting to ranch life after Jessica's dramatic resignation from her CEO position. 16-year-old Sarah and 14-year-old Jake had initially resisted the move from Manhattan to rural Montana, but 6 months of helping care for rescued wildlife had transformed typical urban teenagers into passionate conservationists. "Grandma Maggie, Hope got into the chicken coop again," Sarah announced, her tone carrying the kind of exasperated affection that came from loving something that regularly created problems. "She didn't hurt any of them, but Mrs. Henderson is having fits about lions and livestock." Michael's voice carried from the office where he'd set up a satellite law practice specializing in wildlife protection cases. "Tell Mrs. Henderson that Hope's enclosure fence will be reinforced this week. The contractor's coming Thursday." Jamie emerged from the guest house that had become his permanent residence, his Kansas practicality having proved invaluable in designing security systems that kept dangerous animals contained while allowing them maximum freedom of movement. He'd found the family he'd never been able to create with Sarah, and his expertise in wildlife management had made him indispensable to the sanctuary's operations. "Doc, we've got incoming," he announced, pointing toward the access road where a familiar Kenya Wildlife Service vehicle was approaching. "Looks like our Nairobi visitors are right on time." The reunion was everything Maggie had hoped for and more. Dr. Kenyatta, the KWS veterinarian who'd supervised the cubs' early care, stepped out of the vehicle with the kind of professional satisfaction that came from seeing impossible success stories. Behind him, Saifo and Namsa, the Kenyan Rangers who'd become honorary family members, grinned with the joy of seeing their charges thriving in circumstances that defied every expectation. "The cubs look magnificent," Dr. Kenyatta observed as Hope, Faith, and Robert approached the fence with curious confidence. Their coat development, muscle tone, and behavioral patterns suggest complete adaptation to the climate. "They're Montana lions now," Maggie replied, her voice carrying the pride of successful parenthood. "But they remember their African heritage. Watch this." She called to the cubs in Swahili, words Jamie had taught her during those first difficult months, and all three responded immediately, approaching the fence for the kind of physical contact that would have been impossible with truly wild lions. The Thanksgiving dinner that evening represented everything Maggie had dreamed of during those lonely months after Robert's death. 4 generations gathered around the table, herself and David as the senior survivors, Jessica and Michael with their families, Jamie as the honorary brother she'd never had, and their Kenyan guests whose presence connected Montana to the African savanna where this story had begun. "I want to make a toast," Jessica announced, raising her wine glass with hands that trembled slightly, not from neurological disease, but from emotion. "6 months ago, I thought my mother was having a breakdown. I was terrified she'd get herself killed chasing some crazy adventure that made no sense." "It didn't make sense," Maggie agreed cheerfully. "That was the point. But watching her now," Jessica continued, "seeing what she's built here, understanding what she's accomplished, I realize I never really knew my mother at all. I knew the veterinarian, the wife, the woman who took care of everyone else's needs. I didn't know the warrior." Michael raised his own glass, his lawyer's composure cracking as he addressed the woman who'd given him life twice, once at birth and again by showing him what real courage looked like. "To Mom, who taught us that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." David's toast was simpler, but carried the weight of a man who'd found redemption in protecting the children of his son's killer. "To Tommy, who would have loved every minute of this chaos." As the evening wound down and their guests settled into the comfortable bedrooms that had been prepared for extended visits, Maggie found herself alone on the back porch, wrapped in Robert's old barn coat and watching 3 lions hunt shadows in the moonlight. Their play was becoming more sophisticated as they matured, their movements displaying the fluid grace that would make them apex predators if they'd remained in the wild. "No regrets?" Jamie asked, joining her with 2 cups of coffee and the easy companionship that had developed over months of shared purpose. "None," Maggie replied without hesitation. "My hands shake when I'm nervous, but they're steady when I'm doing what matters. Robert used to say I had the steadiest hands he'd ever seen, not in my fingers, but in my heart." "What about the future? The cubs are getting big and eventually they'll need more space, better facilities, maybe even the possibility of breeding programs that could help their species survive," Maggie finished. "The sanctuary's already planning expansion. Dr. Kenyatta thinks we could house up to 12 lions within 5 years, maybe start a genetic diversity program that connects North American facilities with African conservation efforts." The conversation was interrupted by a familiar sound, Simba's roar echoing across the Montana landscape. The cub's father had remained in Kenya, but his territorial calls during their video conferences suggested he somehow understood that his offspring were safe and thriving thousands of miles away. "Do you think he knows?" Jamie asked. "About what happened to Nuru, about the cubs surviving?" "Lions understand more than we give them credit for," Maggie replied. "And love isn't limited by geography or species. He knows his children are safe. That's enough." As they prepared to go inside, Maggie's phone buzzed with a message that made her smile. A wildlife sanctuary in Alaska was requesting consultation about caring for orphaned bear cubs. Another facility in Colorado needed advice about rehabilitating injured mountain lions. The story of a 72-year-old grandmother who'd delivered lion cubs while under fire had inspired conservation efforts across North America. "Looks like we're expanding again," she told Jamie, showing him the messages. These old hands aren't done yet. Inside the house, 3 generations of family slept peacefully, their dreams filled with possibilities that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. David's guest room contained detailed plans for additional enclosures and educational facilities that would honor Tommy's memory while protecting endangered species. Jessica's laptop held resignation letters from 3 more corporate positions. She was becoming a full-time conservationist with the passion of a convert. And in the specially heated barn that served as temporary nursery, Hope, Faith, and Robert slept in a pile of golden fur and contentment, their steady breathing a testament to the power of love to transcend every boundary that separated species, continents, and the simple human need to matter in a world that often forgot to notice. At 73, Margaret Thompson had finally learned that home wasn't a place. It was the courage to build something worth protecting, and the wisdom to know that family came in all shapes, sizes, and species. The Montana stars wheeled overhead, connecting big sky country to African savannas, and the endless possibility that love, properly applied, could heal almost anything. At 72, Dr. Margaret Thompson thought her life was over, a lonely widow in Montana with shaking hands and children too busy for phone calls. Then she risked everything to deliver lion cubs in Kenya while poachers shot at her back, and discovered something profound. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be. 6 months later, her ranch has become a wildlife sanctuary where 3 generations gather for Sunday dinners, where her successful children quit their corporate jobs to help save endangered species, and where every morning brings purpose instead of emptiness. Margaret's story isn't about lions, it's about the courage to choose adventure over safety, meaning over comfort, and love over loneliness. She transformed her retirement savings into a legacy, her empty nest into a sanctuary, and her final chapter into her greatest adventure. If you're feeling invisible, forgotten, or wondering if your best years are behind you, remember Margaret's steady hands weren't in her fingers, they were in her heart. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is play it safe, and sometimes family comes in forms you never expected. What dream have you been putting off because others think you're too old? Have you ever felt more alive when helping others than when focusing on your own comfort? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear how you're rewriting your own final chapters.